Thank you, Senator Wang. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President, and I welcome this opportunity to speak about the very important issue of horizontal fiscal equalisation in this country and the distribution of the GST. And at the outset, I would like to commend Senator Wang for bringing this bill forward. It is an area, I think, that needs change. Indeed, I think there needs to be major change to how we calculate fiscal equalisation across our nation. And it's not simply an argument about fairness and who deserves more money and who deserves less. It's actually more, in my view, because I think our current system is creating perverse incentives and particularly not encouraging our state governments to develop their resources and develop their industries and their economies, and ultimately that's all what we want our state governments to do, because that's what will create more jobs and more opportunity for all Australians. I'll expand a bit further on that in this contribution, but first I'd like to say to Senator Wang that I too am one of the senators that have defended WA and tried to point out the inequities, and I think I deserve a little bit of credit for that, because actually I'm of course not a Western Australian senator, and I have received some criticism in my home state for standing up for the interests of my Western brothers and sisters. I have done so because I think fundamentally, clearly there's something wrong when a state can receive less than a third of the GST that it raises in that state. At one point, the projections were for it, I think, to fall to around 10% of the GST raised in WA. That did not eventuate, given the fall in iron ore prices, but still, even the fact that that could have potentially been an outcome shows there's something wrong with the system. I also think that while I am in this chamber to represent the interests of Queensland and to represent the interests of regional Queensland in particular, I also believe that I am a senator for the Commonwealth of Australia, and we all have a duty to make sure that we try and encourage the Commonwealth of our nation. And I don't think our current system, and particularly the way it's assessed and implemented, does a good job of keeping us together within that Commonwealth and creating the right environment which ensures we all try and live together as one part of this nation. Now, I want to turn, though, in particular to the provisions of this bill Senator Wang has put forward. I do have to say I won't support the particular provisions in this bill, notwithstanding the fact that I do commend Senator Wang for bringing them forward. I have some questions about the impact of the provisions in this bill, and I don't think it particularly deals with the issues that I'll expand on later with the system. My understanding of the provisions in the bill is it will shift our current arrangements from an averaging approach, or a 3-year averaging approach, to a single-year approach. And while there may be some merit in that recommendation, it doesn't deal with the fundamental issues that I have with the horizontal fiscal equalisation process. And of course, over time, it may not actually, well, it won't by definition make a difference to what a state receives over a 10, 20 or 30-year period. It may, of course, correct some things in the short term, in the transition phase, as Senator Wang has pointed out in his contribution, but I actually hope and think that we need to make some changes for the long term in this area that will fix the problems we have for the future, not just a temporary fix to deal with the anomalies that we've seen during this terms of trade boom. I'd also have some question marks over whether it's appropriate to switch from an averaging regime to a single-year regime as quickly as proposed in this bill, notwithstanding that I think there should be some changes to the way we do things. I recognise that an appropriate transition process perhaps should be considered. There is, of course, other states and territories that receive large amounts of additional funding thanks to the horizontal fiscal equalisation process, and it would also be somewhat unfair on them if the rules of the game were changed mid-game, if you like, and not leave them with the opportunity to appropriately adjust to any particular changes. I want to start, though, I want to talk more broadly about the horizontal fiscal equalisation system. And it's often remarked that somehow this is a sacrosanct methodology that has almost been given to us from some mountain in the Middle East somewhere and in the Old Testament. We can't change, we can't actually amend anything to do with this methodology because it's something that's been handed down by our forefathers and it's almost got some constitutional merit to it, when in fact that's clearly not the case. Not only has this particular way of dividing up the different resources of different states been relatively new, only a few decades old, it's also regularly reviewed and changed. There have been reviews in the past decade, in 2004, 2010, and recently a review in the last few years which was implemented only in the last Commonwealth Grants Commission assessment. And sometimes there are major changes made. These are not just window dressing that occurs at particular times. Indeed, this year's particular assessment for the first time established that an urban transport methodology for the assessment process. So previously, the costs and revenues of public transport for services offered by state governments were not included in the process. This year, for the first time, they were included. And many people probably don't realise or know that that change to include public transport services in the methodology cost Queensland $500 million. $500 million. Because Queensland is a state that's largely dispersed and with large amounts of population in regional areas where state governments generally don't provide public transport services. There are often some private services that do receive subsidies, but they don't directly provide the services themselves. And my understanding of the Commonwealth Grant Commission process is they've only included the services offered directly by state governments, which are almost invariably in our major capital cities. So we've got a process, a horizontal fiscal equalisation process, which is meant to spread the wealth around our nation, and this particular change has instead concentrated the wealth back in our major cities, which I found rather anomalous, and I asked the Commonwealth Grants Commission about it at last estimates. And I have some serious problems with how this is being assessed, because I think one thing we need to take a step back and think about, why do we have this process and what are we trying to achieve with this process? We are trying to achieve with horizontal fiscal equalisation an element of equity across our nation, keeping in mind that this is the Commonwealth of Australia, keeping in mind that I have no problem with ensuring that the people of the Northern Territory, Tasmania and other states receive an appropriate level of public services across our nation, and that will often require transfers of money between states to occur that make that happen. And almost every federation in the world has a system like this in some form. So the argument is not against the equalisation process itself, it is how do we achieve that. And in achieving that, what we should aim to do is to make sure it's as policy neutral as possible. That is the criteria that the Commonwealth Grants Commission themselves say that they apply, but I have serious questions about whether they are actually achieving those objectives in the way they're doing it at the moment. Because take this issue itself, this urban transport issue. The Commonwealth Grants Commission is meant to say, well, however we transfer money, it should not affect the decisions of state governments, the policy decisions. It's meant to be policy neutral. So however we decide to spread money from one state to another, it should not change how state governments do business or what they do. Well, in fact, what's happening with their urban transport methodology is they're looking at how much fares state governments take in. They're looking at the costs of providing bus and train and ferry services. Invariably, in almost all of our states, there's a large gap between those revenues and costs. So there's a net cost of providing these services. And through this process now, state governments receive a subsidy for providing public transport services. Now, the provision of public transport is, of course, a very important one for particularly Australians living in major cities, but it is clearly a policy decision. It's not something that state governments have to provide or must provide. It is a policy decision, and by providing particular states with more urbanised populations greater subsidies for those services, they will of course be subsidising those services, encouraging state governments to provide more of them, and clearly breaching the Commonwealth Grants Commission's principle of policy neutrality. But putting that particular example aside, I've got much greater concern that in the area of mining royalties in particular, this principle of policy neutral is breached on an enormous scale. Once again, the decision to both develop a mining industry itself and the decision to apply a royalty to that mining industry are clearly policy decisions of any government. The resources that WA and Queensland have, yes, are God-given. They are given to us by the Lord, and they have been there, and we're lucky to live in a country with many of these resources. And myself and Senator Wang are lucky to live in states where these resources are quite plentiful. But them alone, those resources alone, don't give anything to the citizens of those states. Just because you walk above some coal or iron ore does not make you any richer or wealthier. The only way you convert those natural resources into some form of wealth and prosperity is to exploit those resources, and that exploitation does require money, it does require political will, and it does require some social and other costs associated with their development. It is also then the case that the actual royalties that apply and are charged to any production of natural resources is a decision for government. Any decision to go higher or lower it will be affected by how much of revenue, of course, that state can retain. And under the current system, they can't retain much. Indeed, in the Queensland Government submission to the recent Commonwealth Grants Commission assessment, they found that if Queensland were to increase the rate of royalties on a particular thermal or coking coal, for example, Queensland would only retain its population share of the increase in revenue. Because the assessment is blind to the revenue raised, Queensland would only receive back how much population it accounts for in our Commonwealth, which is about 20%. So if Queensland Government increased its royalty rates on coal by 50% or something and raised a few more $1 billion, it would only retain 20% of that increased revenue. 80% would go back to the other states. In WA it's worse, of course, because they're a much smaller proportion of our country. They would only retain 90% of the increased royalties raised. And in Northern Territory, sorry Senator Scullion, in Northern Territory, because you only represent 1% of our population, if Northern Territory decide to increase a royalty, they would retain just 1%. They would lose 99% of the revenues associated with that increase in royalties. That's all on page 34 of the Queensland Government submission to the Commonwealth Grants Commission. How can that be seen as a policy-neutral approach? It clearly is not a policy-neutral approach. In the case of Western Australia, which has received lots of attention, the Commission estimates that they raise around $7.2 billion in royalties, and I should say that includes payments in lieu for some offshore resources from the Commonwealth, $7.2 billion last financial year. They had $4.6 billion of that taken away, if you like, and redistributed to other states as a part of the assessment process. They lost 63% of their total revenues that were raised in Western Australia from mainly, of course, iron ore. Again, how can that be seen to be policy neutral? How can that be seen to not influence the decisions of state governments? I said before that there's those two decisions. There's a royalty rate, and then there's the costs of actually developing a mining industry. Mining does require a fair amount of commitment from governments to get off the ground. It often occurs in very desolate and new areas of our country. There's currently proposals for a mine not too far from where I live in the Galilee Basin, which is very desolate, and there's almost no civilisation for hundreds of kilometres around that mine. That will require a significant investment from the state government in terms of new infrastructure for new areas, just as it would if there was a new suburb to rise up in a city or a new area of development in an inner city. It will require investment. But the Commonwealth Grants Commission at the moment, in my view, seriously underestimates those costs, and therefore does not take into account the net revenues that the state would accrue, but more the gross revenues that they accrue from a mining industry, which again breaches their principle of policy neutrality. So the Queensland Government estimates that the Commission only makes account for around 3% of gross revenues to be factored in, gross royalty revenues I should say, to be factored in as the cost of developing a new mining industry. Whereas I think it's interesting for us to note that Canada recently. It was a federation just like ourselves, and a large mining country like ourselves, or oil and gas country, or a natural resources country like us as well. They've got this same issue, where those resources are concentrated in their western provinces largely, and they have to account for an equalisation process for that. Canada has recently, in the last few years, decided that they will provide a 50% discount on royalty revenues before they calculate the redistribution or equalisation process. 50% discount. That's their estimate, a broad estimate, obviously, and only an estimate of how much it would cost in net terms to establish a mining industry for a state government, and what they deserve to have to build the infrastructure required and support an industry which does still produce enormous amounts of wealth and net wealth to a state and to a country. Now, we only discount it by around 3%. Canada's doing it by 50%. What concerns me about this in particular, this is something that's happened in the last few years, and this is something that the Queensland Government, I believe perhaps the WA Government as well, but certainly the Queensland Government put in their submission to the Commonwealth Grants Commission that it should consider the Canadian decision and look at maybe a more generous interpretation of mining costs before it calculates an equalisation process. I asked Mr Spasajevic, and I probably mispronounced his name and I apologise, who is, I believe, the head of the Commonwealth Grants Commission. I asked at estimates, are you familiar with Canada's recent changes? No, Mr Spasajevic said. So you have not looked at that at all? No. Why not? I said. He said, why should I have? Well, one reason he should have, because it was in the Queensland Government submission made to his organisation for their assessment process. We have a Commonwealth Grants Commission who has made an assessment. Very complex issues, I certainly appreciate. And I can reasonably appreciate that people and Australians will come to different views about what the final conclusions would be. What I cannot appreciate is a Commonwealth Grants Commission that apparently is blind to a very important part of the Queensland Government submission, probably the most important part of their calculations. It was in the WA Government's commission, state submission, as well, Senator Wang informs me. Two major states, a massive issue in terms of the redistribution process, and the Commonwealth Grants Commission is blind to it, has not looked at it, has not engaged in it, hasn't even bothered to look at what Canada is doing and has changed. And that's something that's been pointed out to them by their stakeholders. They only consult with state governments, they don't consult with the wider community. They only have to consult with 8 states and territories. It's pretty easy, it'd be pretty simple, but they don't even take the time, seemingly, to get across the detail of their submissions, and that is very concerning to me. It's very concerning to me, given that the next decision that the Commonwealth Grants Commission will be confronted with in this space is how it treats the coal seam gas industry in Queensland. Once again, Queensland is lucky to have resources of coal seam gas in its state, but other states are lucky too. New South Wales has substantial resources, as does Victoria. And in both of those states there have not been substantial production. Indeed, in Victoria there's a moratorium on coal seam gas production right now, but Queensland have made the decision to develop its industry. It's been a difficult decision. It's required a certain amount of created a certain amount of political angst in Queensland, and I must say, as a representative of some people, it certainly hasn't gone smoothly for many farmers and landowners. But the decision's been made. It's been made because Queensland wanted to generate the jobs, the industry, and of course the royalty revenue from coal seam gas. The royalty revenue is expected to generate around $800 million over the next decade or so, thanks to this industry. And what I'm concerned about is now the Commonwealth Grants Commission will have a look at this, and going on what they do to WA, who lose 63% of their iron ore revenue, what if we lose 50–60% of the $800 million to other states? And therefore we'd effectively be subsidising the states of New South Wales and Victoria, who have not made a decision, and it's their right not to make a decision to develop their industry, but have decided to forego the opportunity to exploit their God-given resources, forego the political pain and other costs associated with developing those resources, but will be bailed out by a state who has made that decision and who have created thousands of jobs in Queensland and an enormous industry across the state and our nation. I don't think that's, one, particularly fair, but more importantly, I certainly don't think it's efficient. I certainly don't think it's what we need to create a productive economy, to create the right environment for state governments to ensure that they are making the decisions that promote economic growth in our country, promote jobs and promote higher incomes and prosperity for us all. The current system is failing us. It is failing us as a nation. It needs to change. I think the Commonwealth Grants Commission need to kick up the backside because clearly they're not doing their job at the moment. And something needs to change here. I once again commend Senator Wang for bringing this forward, and it's a conversation we need to continue to have as a nation.
Thank you.